Now at NugaLights.com.
You're invited to the Beaters annual New Year's Eve Bash, 7 p.m. at the Convention Center.
So welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Linda about historical Christmases in Chattanooga. It would be nice, perhaps all of our topics will have a happy theme, but in the late 1870s, Chattanooga and many parts of, I guess, the South anyway, were really struggling with yellow fever.
They were. In fact, New Orleans probably had the highest number of deaths from yellow fever. But Chattanooga, 1878, a lot of people thought that perhaps Chattanooga would be safe because if you look at us from a geological standpoint, we're sort of in the bowl, surrounded by the mountains, but what they were not considering was the fact that we were the crossroads for all the railroads going south and north, east and west, and once the yellow fever came, it had a devastating result for Chattanooga. The numbers of people who died, you know, there's a section out at Forest Hills for the yellow fever victims. Chambliss Children's Home begins because there are so many children who are left orphaned, and the ladies of Chattanooga, you know, that fall, that Christmas, began to come together to think about how do we take care of the orphans? Mm-hmm. How do we, you know, if the scriptures say take care of the widows and the orphans, how do we do that as a community? And out of that, of course, Chambliss Center for Children will emerge.
You know, a lot of us are still feeling the effects of COVID when we were isolated and we couldn't see each other and churches were suspended and all of that. My understanding of that yellow fever period was that it was not quick. It lasted, weren't churches closed for even a couple of years?
Churches were closed for close to 2 years. You know, some would eventually try to open back up, but then close back. People were cautious of being out and being together. That sense of isolation that we've all recently experienced, you know, makes it difficult to celebrate even days that are joyous.
So in December of this would have been like 1878.
Yes.
Are there any things that we know about that particular Christmas?
We know that people went back to homemade Christmases, and you'll see that pattern whenever difficulty strikes in a community. Mm-hmm. So there are stories, you can go back and look in the newspapers. Newspapers never shut down. Everybody else is isolated, but there are stories of people writing poems for each other, writing letters, drawing pictures, things that they could do at home without having to get out and do anything else. You know, grandmother bakes something for which she has the ingredients at home.
Right.
I mean, think about, I'm trying to think what I could bake very readily. It's the week, you know, it's Christmas, so my larder is stocked a little better than it normally would be, but not necessarily.
In the 1870s, you mentioned the railroads, which of course we were still big with, even though...
We were, and industry had taken off here. And that's probably another reason maybe the city was hit as hard as it was that we had attracted a lot of people from other communities, and there had been a lot of travel back and forth. Chattanooga in 1871 is back at full steam. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it, but we had by 1868 had advertised in all the northeastern newspapers and the Ohio Valley newspapers encouraging carpetbaggers to come to Chattanooga.
Have we always been that divided town of a mixture of northern and southern?
It became much more predominant after.
Town, not divided.
Well, it's unified, but of different origins. Became more so after the American Civil War, because so many of the soldiers that came here with the Ohio units, the Pennsylvania units, the New York, saw the region and saw the beauty and thought this might be a good place to raise children. Yeah. And we encouraged them to bring their talents, to bring their capital, to bring innovative ideas. And that by Christmas of 1878, the devastation of the yellow fever was that it sort of screeched to a halt the impetus that Chattanooga had for growth and innovation and technology, all the things that were going on here that were not happening in other parts of the Deep South.
So I have a story, and I think it's a true story, is that so the churches, you know, had different locations. So my understanding is at one point, St. Paul's was where the Mountain City Club is, and across the street from that, where the West Village is so beautiful, was Second Presbyterian. That would have been in the 1870s. And there was a woman who was a member of that church at Second Pres named Hattie Ackerman.
Oh,
Is that
yes.
a name you know?
Oh, my heavens, yes.
So why don't you tell us who Hattie Ackerman
Well,
was?
you know, you hear the stories about her and her work during the
She was a
yellow
nurse.
fever. She was a nurse and absolutely out there. You know, people were so fearful because we didn't know a lot about the spread of disease then the way that we do now. You know, the names that you hear about are Hattie Ackerman. Some of the people who had, you know, there was a gambler here in Chattanooga who became really involved in getting medical supplies to those who were suffering from the yellow fever, who ends up dying as a young man, buried at the cemetery there across from UTC. It's interesting how situations like that, there are people who change the course of history by their courage.
Whose name you otherwise would not know.
You know, who would have remembered Miss Ackerman other than the fact that she became sort of the angel of the battlefield?
So here's the story I know about her. It's that she was young. She was in her 20s, and she was not native to Chattanooga. She had come to study from, I think, Ohio or something. Anyway, she came down in her nursing of the sick. She came down with yellow fever and she died.
She did.
So years later, Second Presbyterian Church grew large enough where their congregation had outgrown the building at the time, and they moved to their existing location down at 6th and Pine or 7th and Pine. But they had loved her, Hattie Ackerman, and while they were still at this church there at the West Village, they had created this beautiful, 14 or more feet, stained glass window in her memory. But then they moved to the church, the new church, and they hated to leave that window. So in 1891, when they built the church, they moved that window dedicated to Hattie Ackerman. So really, if you go to Second Presbyterian Church, that Hattie Ackerman window predates
And see,
the
I did
existing
not
church.
know that. I love the fact that someone who uses that spark of divinity that we all have in them for the greater good is not forgotten. That's
Right.
history in stained glass.
I like your phrase, the spark of divinity that we all have. What a good week to be remembering that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's flash forward when we come back, and
Okay.
let's talk about the Depression era. I think a lot of us watching and us talking can relate to that. We've heard some of the stories, but what a good time for us to be remembering what it's like to stretch a dollar.
Yes.
Okay, we're back.
O'Reilly Auto Parts World of Wheels Custom Auto Show, January 6th through 8th. See customs, classics, and feature cars, and meet TV stars, plus free Hot Wheels and costume characters for the kids. Discount tickets at O'Reilly Auto Parts. Details at worldofwheels.net.
Have a car? A title? You could get up to $6,500 with TitleMax. Go to TitleMax.com and enter your car year, make, and model. See how much you could get. Check out TitleMax.com for the most cash you need. Check out TitleMax.com and shop us for